Andrew Johnson was a pretty crappy president. This isn't some hot take. Actual historians rank him somewhere near the bottom in comparison to other presidents. It doesn't help that he had the unenviable task of dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War, but he was uniquely terrible in his own right. Some of his crowning accomplishments include opposing the 14th Amendment, which would have granted citizenship to millions of newly freed slaves, and opposing the Freedmen's Bureau, which educated them. His most notable achievement, however, was doing a campaign tour so spectacularly awful that it ended up getting him impeached. So a bit of context first. Following the Civil War, the government engaged in a program of reconstruction in the former rebel states. This included physical reconstruction, like rebuilding infrastructure, but also a sort of spiritual reconstruction, reuniting the country and making the Union whole again. There were two competing visions of reconstruction at the time. There was congressional reconstruction, proposed by the liberal Republican-controlled Congress, which would see dramatic changes in the former Confederacy that included harsh punishments for former Confederates and increased equality for freed slaves. The other type proposed by President Andrew Johnson was cleverly named Presidential Reconstruction. This would see the rapid refolding of the Confederate states into the Union and leaving the Southern social hierarchy largely unchanged. By 1866, President Johnson was getting pretty frustrated with Congress and sought to unite Northern and Southern conservatives into a winning coalition in that year's congressional elections. So in the summer of that year, Andy embarked on a weeks-long tour of the northern U.S., starting in Washington, D.C., and swinging around the circle to eventually return there. Now, here's something to keep in mind about Andrew Johnson. You see, Andrew was an asshole. Prior to his inauguration as President Lincoln's vice president in 1865, Johnson got roaring drunk to treat a case of typhoid fever. His inaugural address was filled with drunken attacks against members of the cabinet, during which he forgot the name of one of the cabinet members and loudly asked someone off stage what his name was. The scene was so bad that President Lincoln apparently had an expression of, quote, unutterable sorrow, and outgoing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin was just tugging on Johnson's coat going, "Hey, Andy, please stop this is very embarrassing." One senator watching this nightmare unfold wrote to his wife saying, quote, "The inauguration went off very well, except that the vice president-elect was too drunk to perform his duties and disgraced himself and the Senate by making a drunken, foolish speech." Even when not completely hammered, Johnson was pretty self-centered and belligerent. Johnson used an 1866 speech honoring George Washington's birthday to celebrate his own accomplishments around 200 times and criticize his political opponents. So, by the summer of 1866, Johnson had the reputation of a drunken, narcissistic idiot. He knew that he probably couldn't win over the masses by himself. Therefore, he thought it best to drag some much more popular and well-respected folks along with him. Among them were Secretary of State William H. Seward and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, both Lincoln administration veterans who had overseen the Civil War. Others included war heroes Admiral David Farragut and General George Meade. But probably the most famous figure present was General Ulysses S Grant, a veritable god in the North. Grant actually hated Johnson's guts and probably wanted to see him fail, but Johnson begged him to come along, and Grant apparently felt, quote, it would be indecorous to object any longer to Johnson's requests. The first few stops on the tour went well enough. In Baltimore, he was greeted by 100,000 enthusiastic supporters. Another 200,000 cheered him on in New York, though it was pretty obvious the applause was for Grant and Farragut rather than for Johnson. Things started going sour as they went further north and west, however. In Albany, New York's governor refused to introduce the president to the state's legislature, a pretty huge slight. Then, near the town of Auburn, New York, a boy's leg was cut off by the president's train's wheels. As the train moved westward, according to Mexican ambassador to the U.S., Matias Romero, many of the stars of the tour became ill.
The excitement of the itinerary occasioned by the frequent receptions and parades has been such that almost all the people who came with the president are indisposed, since, besides the excitement, we have necessarily had a great irregularity in the meals. If one adds to this a little sleep which we have enjoyed due to rising early and going to bed late, one will form an approximate idea of the torment which this journey has been.
By the time his tour left Buffalo, New York, Johnson ran into another problem: General Grant's alcoholism. He was so plastered at one point that he, quote, had to be taken into a baggage car, compelled to lie down on a pile of empty sacks and rubbish and remain there. In Cleveland, things got even worse.
It could be worse, though at least we're not Detroit!
When hecklers told Johnson he should hang former Confederate President Jefferson Davis, he instead replied that they should hang Thaddeus Stephen and Wendell Phillips, two fierce, loyal Unionists in Congress. Aside from threatening his political opponents, Johnson also frequently compared himself to Jesus Christ, which was probably not the move to make in a devoutly Christian country. In Chicago, where Johnson was to dedicate a statue in honor of the late Senator Stephen Douglas, his welcome was also fairly cold. Upon entering the city, General Grant was mobbed by well-wishers calling on him to run for office and defeat President Johnson. On the way there, according to Ambassador Romero, his nation received more enthusiasm than the president.
In transit, various presentations occurred, and at one of them, 3 enthusiastic cheers for the Republic were given, while the proposals in honor of the president were responded to very spiritlessly. This disgusted Seward, who, speaking immediately thereafter, said that he could not believe that they would desire peace for the Mexican Republic more than for their own country.
In Indianapolis, the president was booed off the stage and a gunfight between his supporters and opponents led to 1 death. Though that wasn't the last death associated with Johnson's tour. A few days after the Indianapolis incident, Johnson was set to speak in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Anticipating his arrival, the townsfolk set up some bleachers for them to view the proceedings. As the train pulled into the station, however, the grandstand collapsed, causing 400 people to plummet nearly 30 feet. 13 were killed and hundreds more were injured. To keep with the schedule, the train departed quickly with the situation still dire. Later on, President Johnson gave the victims' families $500 as a form of consolation. This absolute nightmare of a tour came to a merciful close after 18 days with a brief, largely calm event in Baltimore, Maryland. Needless to say, the response to this tour was overwhelmingly negative. One newspaper wrote, quote, "If he would just stay in the White House, keep his mouth shut, and not make a fool of himself, disgusting friend and foe alike, the President of the United States might command some respect." General Grant told his wife that Johnson's speeches, quote, "were a national disgrace." He told a war correspondent, quote, that "I am disgusted at hearing a man make speeches on the way to his funeral," which is honestly one of the greatest sentences I've ever read. The 1866 elections were a pretty huge disaster for Johnson's Democrats. The Republicans strengthened their majorities in the House and the Senate, and Congress ended up impeaching Johnson in 1868. Though the impeachment was largely over the issue of a mishandling of a firing of a cabinet secretary, I'm not going to get into it, it's very boring. Article 10 of the Articles of Impeachment chastised the president for his belligerent campaign tour, saying he, quote,
"On numerous occasions made with a loud voice certain intemperate, inflammatory, and scandalous harangues, and did therein utter loud threats and bitter menaces against Congress and the laws of the United States duly enacted thereby, amid the cries, jeers, and laughter of the multitudes then assembled and within bearing."
Though Johnson avoided removal from office by just 1 vote in the Senate, Johnson's future political prospects were grim. In 1868, he failed to regain the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency and left office in 1869, succeeded by, guess who, Ulysses S Grant. Later that year, he sought an open Senate seat in Tennessee, but failed to get it. In 1872, he sought an open House of Representatives seat, but failed to get it. In 1875, he finally reigned victorious and was elected to the Senate. He then proceeded to die of a stroke a few months after his inauguration. If there's one thing we can learn from Johnson's terrible, no-good swing around the circle, it's that having rallies based in grievance and belligerence isn't super great, and telling your supporters to attack their rivals probably isn't a good idea either. Thankfully, no president has ever made the same mistake. I'd like to thank 2 creators who lent me their voices for this video. Nomad Star lent his voice for the Mexican ambassador, and Arkin the American for the Articles of Impeachment. I've left their YouTube and Twitter links in the description, and I highly recommend that you check them out. To the rest of you, thank you for watching. If you like this video, be sure to like and comment. That sort of thing always helps with the algorithm. Also, share this video with your friends, spam it in Discords, you know, the usual. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already.